The Maxwell architecture is one that I hold dear to my heart, but with the GTX 970 being somewhat equivalent in performance to the GTX 1060 or the 1650, is this former performance segment graphics card still of any use today? Now, the GPU is a bit on the odd side. The GPU-Z window seen on screen does show most of its parameters, but those 4GB and that 256-bit memory bus, that's a bit of a lie. The first 3.5GB of VRAM is accessible on a 224-bit bus, and the last half gig through a choked 32-bit bus. This was due to the SM configuration on the GM204 GPU, and the 3.5GB of VRAM was only one of the effects. In the class action lawsuit that followed, it was detailed that the ROPs and the L2 cache were also affected. For the 148 watts TDP, AVGA strapped a pretty good 2-fans cooler on top. And despite that TDP going frequently above 160 watts, the temperatures remain in check at 65 degrees Celsius, or 45 C delta over ambient in load. The test system used to get a feeling on how the card runs uses a Ryzen 5 3600 with 32GB of DDR4 in dual channel running at 3000 MHz. Some tests were also performed with a Ryzen 5 2600, and this will be mentioned when this is the case. Since Marvel Rivals is a multiplayer title, what I typically aim for is at least 60 FPS for the 1% lows. The GTX manages to clear that better at low settings and 720 resolution. The average of 89 FPS is good, the 1% lows is close to 70. At 1080 resolution, the card is just a tad too slow, which makes me think that there is probably a sweet spot between 720 and 1080, where the card would get 60 FPS for the 1% lows. Cyberpunk 2077, however, is a single-player title, and while being a first-person shooter, it's a slow-paced one, so 30 FPS for the 1% lows will do just fine. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, the GTX 970 barely makes it with an average FPS of 42 and the 1% lows of 29. But the numbers were captured in the canned benchmark. Some areas of the game might have you dropping the resolution a bit. 1600 by 900 will provide a bit of performance margin without sacrificing too much on visuals. Fortunately, the finals is playable at low settings at all tested resolutions, with 1% lows between 47 and 73 FPS and averages between 62 and 105. I got somewhat similar results with the Ryzen 5 2600, so the results are actually relevant for the GPU. The game felt fine despite the somewhat lackluster performance at higher resolutions. For Robocop, the bar is set lower, at 30 FPS for the 1% lows. 1600 by 900 medium settings is the best configuration where the GTX 970 delivers, with an average high of 40 FPS and the 1% lows at 32. 720 resolution and high settings is also doable, but I'd rather have the extra resolution than the eye candy. 1080 low settings, however, is a difficult sell, with an average FPS at 30 and the 1% lows in the low 20s. You have seen the results for Fortnite already when reviewing the Ryzen 5 used in the test system. Running in performance mode and a view distances too far, the game is CPU bound with an average FPS above 200 and 1% lows around 120. No complaints about the GTX 970. Same goes for reload, but the smaller map and the lower players count help increase the two performance metrics to almost 270 FPS for the average and high 150s for the 1% lows. Again, playing the game in performance mode with the GTX 970 is a recipe for getting CPU bound. An older title on the older Unreal Engine 4, Terminator Resistance runs perfectly fine on the GTX 970. Epic settings and 1440p resolution has the card averaging 87 FPS and going just above 60 FPS for the 1% lows. There's really no need to drop any settings. At low settings but no FSR, Counter-Strike 2 will run CPU bound. I did retest with the Ryzen 5 3600 and the GTX 970 gave the CPU a good workout with an average FPS above 200 and 1% lows in the mid-90s. Just like with the Fortnite results, nothing new here if you watch the review on the Ryzen 5 3600. Weirdly enough, Far Cry 6, at least according to the canned benchmark, runs at 37 FPS for the average and 31-41% lows. And this is at 1440 high settings. 1080 resolution and ultra settings works on average of 43 FPS and a 1% loss of 35. Running Apex Legends at low settings is still a GPU bound scenario when it comes to the GTX 970. The game is perfectly playable at all tested resolutions with averages ranging between 158 and 242 FPS and 1% loss between 112 and 166. The performance at 1080 is just fine, no need to drop the resolution. While Doom Eternal is a single-player title, it is best played at higher FPS. The aim here is to get the 1% lows at 60 FPS or higher. 1080 resolution and low settings clear the bar with an average FPS in the high 90s and the 1% lows at 70. Going from low to medium settings at the same resolution has the average dropping to 86 and the 1% lows at 58. Still fine for this game. Rainbow Six Siege is at the edge between GPU bound and CPU bound behaviors, even at low settings. 1080 resolution has the GPU doing a lot of the work, with average frame rates at 123 FPS at 100% resolution scale and 176 FPS at 50% resolution scale. The 1% lows landed at 97 and 137 FPS respectively. 720 resolution results, however, are CPU bound by the Ryzen 5 2600 this time around. And since 1080 resolution already meets the minimum requirements of 60 plus FPS for the 1% lows, my advice is to just forget about it. 1080 resolution and high settings is a bit too much for the GTX 970 when it comes to control. The average FPS of 31 is not what I'd label a good experience, and the 26 FPS for the 1% lows just doesn't help. Medium settings, however, will have the 1% lows at 35 and the average at 43. Overwatch 2 stays firmly GPU bound at low settings, even when using the Ryzen 5 2600. The frame rate goes up as the resolution drops, in an almost linear fashion, with the average ranging between 276 at 1080 resolution and 493 at 720. The 1% lows are above 200 FPS at Full HD and about 350 at 1280 by 720. But there's really no need to drop from 1080, the performance is good enough already. Aiming for the balanced preset in Resident Evil 4 means dropping the resolution to 1600 by 900. This way the 1% lows manages to stay above 30 FPS with an average of 50. 1080 resolution means dropping the 1% lows in the high 20s at the same balanced preset. Performance preset, however, with FSR turned off, gets that percentile metric at 40 and the average at 57 FPS. I'd go with 1600 by 900 balanced and switch to 1080 performance only if the FPS drops too much. Dota 2 gets CPU bound at 1080 resolution and low settings even with weaker cards. The average 115 FPS and the 1% lows of 62 are more relevant for the Ryzen 5 2600 that was used to capture the data rather than for the GTX 970. The benchmark for Shadow of the Tomb Raider will point out an interesting behavior for the GTX 970. 1080 resolution and high settings has the GTX 970 averaging 52 FPS and providing 1% lows of 31. 1440 resolution, however, requires dropping all the way to medium settings, where the average FPS makes it to 40. The 1% lows, however, are just shy of 30. Borderlands 3 is playable at 1080 resolution and almost all tested settings profiles. Badass is almost there with the average FPS at 35 and the 1% lows of 29. Ultra settings has the 1% lows at 31 and the average FPS at 37. I like Maxwell cards. NVidia's first generation of GPUs that supported DirectX 12 was built on the same 28nm node as the GCN 1 and 2 cards. The power efficiency of the NVIDIA cards, however, has the GTX 970 stating a TDP of less than 150, compared to the 290 for the performance matching Radeons. As for the 3.5 gigs of VRAM, most online titles will not use that much when played at low settings, which leaves just the single-player games as potentially troublesome for the GTX 970. The alternatives for the GTX 970 are the RX 570 and the R9 290 variants, but with the latter having suffered through a lifetime of thermal stress and now left without driver support, it is the RX 570 that could be its rival. Unfortunately for AMD, their Polaris cards seem to be priced around 40 plus USD, while quite a few GTX 970s seem to be priced 10 USD less, making the NVIDIA card a more budget-friendly option. The more you buy, the more you save, I guess. Anyway, enough of the GTX 970. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll